Hello, I'm that geeky gamer, and welcome to my show. You know, I've always had mixed feelings when it comes to fighting games. Sometimes I really love them and think they are some of the most fun you can have with a game. And other times they make me so frustrated and angry that I just want to throw the damn game out the window. To a certain degree, I guess this is how it should be with fighting games. But with that said, I have to say that I, for the most part, couldn't get all that into fighting games. Yes, I do think they are loads of fun, but there was just something about them that always kept me at a bit of a distance. That is until this one series came along and changed everything for me. It became an instant favorite and a huge part of my gaming life. It just had everything. Great characters, awesome moves, fantastic gameplay, and in my opinion, the best control system for any fighting game. However, I should probably point out that I didn't actually get into this series from the beginning. The first game I played was actually the sequel, which was way better than the original, but was the original truly a bad game, or just a bit worse than the sequels? Well, let's not delay this any further. Let's get ready to fight and enter the first King of Iron Fist tournament, also known as Tekken, and find out just how this game holds up. So how should we start this thing? Well, how about we take a look at our competitors first. This game gives you a choice of 8 characters to start off with 10 more to unlock. This gives you a fairly wide choice of fighting styles and moves, so everyone should be able to find a fighter suited to their tastes. Recommending a fighter is a bit hard, as it really comes down to what sort of fighting styles and techniques you want, but if I had to pick one, I would probably go for Kazuya. He just seems like the most well-rounded character, and he has the best moveset, at least in my opinion. Besides, he's the character I did the best with, so I'm going with Kazuya as my choice. So, once you've picked your fighter, you go through 9 stages of fights against 9 other fighters. The last stage is always against Heihachi, unless you play as Heihachi, and the 8th stage is always against the so-called sub-boss, which is the character you unlock when you win with the character you have chosen. For example, you unlock Lee when you win with Kazuya, Wang with Law, and Kuma with Paul. There are, however, 2 characters that are unlocked by other means. To unlock Heihachi, you have to complete all the 9 stages without using a single continue. This can be somewhat difficult, but considering you can alter both the difficulty and number of rounds, it's not really a problem. Unlocking Devil Kazuya, however, is im-fucking-possible. I have never been able to do it, and neither have a lot of people. In fact, some people think it isn't actually possible, and that it's all just a myth. Well, it's not a hoax. Devil Kazuya can be unlocked, but the way to do it is unbelievably and ridiculously hard. You see, when you start up Tekken, you're actually greeted with a game of Galaga before Tekken actually starts. In order to unlock Devil Kazuya, you have to beat 8 stages of this Galaga game and then choose Kazuya using the start button. You will then be playing as Devil Kazuya. You might think, well, that doesn't sound all that difficult, but you'd be very, very wrong. You see, beating even a single stage of Galaga means getting a perfect score. In other words, you have to play perfectly for 8 stages in order to do this. You know what, person responsible for this idea, whoever you are? Fuck you! Fuck you in the fucking eye, okay? Demanding that the player does something absolutely perfectly has never, ever, not once been a good idea. You should always, always leave at least a little room for error, even if it's not that much room. Having to play absolutely perfectly, especially for an extended amount of time, usually sucks all the fun out of any game, at least in my experience, because usually you're going to fuck up a few times. That's part of the experience! Okay, yeah, this isn't something you have to do, and in my opinion, you shouldn't even bother trying, but that almost makes this even more annoying. Why bother making something that it didn't even need to be in the game in the first place this frustrating and difficult? Oh, and the cherry on top of the cake here is that if you do somehow manage to do this, your reward basically boils down to a really crappy and hideous third costume for Kazuya. No, it's not like in the other games where the devil costume comes with a slightly different set of moves and a different story. It's just a fucking costume. Whoop-de-fucking-do! This is just a complete waste and should not have been included in the game. As this is an optional part, I wouldn't necessarily call it a flaw, but it is utterly ridiculous and seriously infuriating. So anyway, let's take a look at one of, if not the biggest selling point of the game, at least in my opinion, the fighting system. Now, in a lot of other fighters, the buttons correspond to a high or low kick or punch, or possibly a strong or weak kick or punch. In Tekken, however, the buttons correspond to the fighter's limbs. One button controls the left arm, one controls the right arm, one controls the left leg, and one controls the right leg. In my opinion, this works way better than the other systems, as it gives you more control more easily. Yeah, I know, a lot of people would probably say that I just suck too much to really appreciate stuff like Street Fighter and that I only like Tekken because it's easier, but I would disagree. It might be a bit easier than some other fighting games, but the main reason I like this system better is that it's just more accessible. It just gives you more control. At least that's what it feels like. It also makes it easier to figure out combos and special moves, and if that's a bad thing, I hope this game sucks. I mean, I like being able to figure out some moves without having to look up a moves list, and while you may occasionally have to do that with this game as well, you can figure out a lot more moves on your own than with a lot of other fighters. If you see someone doing a move that involves using the left arm and right leg or whatever, it's fairly safe to assume that the move involves the buttons for those limbs. In other fighters, you would possibly have to figure out if it involves the button for a weak or strong kick or punch, which might not be as easy. So yeah, this system might be easier, but I don't think that's wrong at all. Now, one of the main selling points of many fighting games is the multiplayer part, and while I agree that the multiplayer is a huge part of these games, and that it can sometimes be what makes them the most fun, I won't really look at that part. Why? Two reasons. One, any game with a single player part should always be playable as a single player game. And two, I just don't want to. Besides, you should already know that the multiplayer part is pretty solid, just like any other fighting game. Okay, so you probably already get that I think this game is pretty good. But it does have quite a few flaws, so let's take a look at some of them, shall we? The first and most obvious problem in this game is that it is fairly slow. The controls are a bit stiff and everything moves a bit too slow. Yeah, I know, this is one of the first 3D fighting games ever made, so you can't expect perfection, but it's still a relatively slow game, especially for a fighting game. I mean, in comparison to the sequel, this game is a crippled old guy. That might be a bit of an unfair comparison, but the sequel was released just about a year after the original, so it's not like I'm comparing something from two different generations. Now, this isn't a game-breaking flaw, but it does occasionally create a bit more frustration than necessary. Another problem that sort of ties in with the slowness is that jumping in this game is just ridiculous. They jump so ludicrously high. I mean, haven't the creators heard of gravity? Apparently, this was a fairly common problem among the first few 3D fighters, and it might not be as bad in Tekken as in, say, Virtua Fighter, but it's still really dumb. Now, you might say this shouldn't really be a big problem, as you can just avoid jumping if you don't like it, but you see, that's not as easy as you would think. For some reason, the characters have a tendency to jump when you're trying to get them to move sideways. Occasionally, this might be because my finger slips and presses the up button instead of the left or right button, but this problem seems to happen way more in this game than any of the sequels, and I promise you that I am pressing left or right most of the times this happens. Whether this is some error in the game, or if it's the controls that are just flawed, I'm not sure, but this causes some seriously frustrating moments. So anyway, just to wrap up the part about the flaws of the game, I'll just quickly mention the fact that this game also has a smaller moveset than the rest of the series, which, considering it's the first of the series, isn't really all that bad, but it's definitely noticeable. This game also seems to be much more of a direct port from the arcade version than the subsequent titles. There is no extra modes or secret unlockables, apart from the extra characters, just the arcade mode. In most of the other games in the series, you usually had a few more modes and extras. Again, this is a very minor problem, but it would have been nice to get something extra in the home version. There's not much story either, at least not in-game. Granted, these sort of games don't exactly require a lot of story, and there actually is a fair bit of story to be found in the manual or online, but in the game itself, all you get is the opening and ending cinematics, which don't really tell you all that much. By the way, that's something I've never been able to figure out. In at least the first 3 games in the series, you don't get that much story in-game, just some cutscenes. But apparently, there is a fair bit of story in these games. I know at least to a certain degree what these stories are, but I found it out online. Where exactly were these stories told? In the manuals? There is a fair bit of info in them, but the stuff that is supposedly the stories of these games are nowhere to be seen in the manuals, and definitely not in the games, at least not that I remember seeing. It's not a big deal at all, but I just don't understand where these stories came from. Why couldn't they just be told through the games? I just find that really weird. Finally, I have to say that although the game for the most part looks very good for its time, some things just look horrible. They didn't really have facial animation yet when this was released, so some characters have really weird permanent expressions. For instance, Law looks like he's been lobotomized. Heihachi has had his jaws wired shut. And Kuma looks like fucking roadkill. Seriously, he looks like an overgrown sloth or something. He definitely doesn't look anything like a fucking bear. So yeah, this game has its issues and it can get pretty frustrating. I mean, really frustrating. But then again, that's true of most fighters, at least in my opinion. All things considered though, this is a pretty good game. It's far from perfect, but considering it is one of the earliest 3D fighters ever made, you have to cut it some slack. It's not really on par with the rest of the series, but then again, if this hadn't been made, none of the subsequent sequels would have been made either. I still maintain that even with all its flaws, Tekken is a much better game than Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, Marvel vs. Capcom, and Virtua Fighter. In fact, the only other fighting games that I feel might be a bit better than Tekken is the Soul Calibur games and the Super Smash Bros. Games. That's not to say that any of these games are bad, they're just not as good as Tekken. So that's Tekken. I don't really know what else to say about it. It's not a perfect game, but it's one of the best fighters out there, especially if you just look at early 3D fighters. It's not a game for everyone, but then again, no fighter ever is. If you're looking for an excellent fighter with a great set of characters, awesome moves, and a fantastic fighting system, definitely give this one a try. You might get a slightly better experience with one of the sequels, but this first entry in the series definitely deserves a second look. Well, that's about all I have to say this week. Hope you enjoyed this review, and I hope you check back next week for a new episode. Thanks for watching. Bye.